Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Robin Dorshow, and I'm the director of the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being part of this exciting program. Initially, this was going to be a one-off. We were going to have a panel of three, four, five women who were going to talk, and it was going to be one and done. But we had so much interest that we are probably going to be having 3 parts. So watch for more information eventually, and each time the panelists will be different. So again, thank you for being here. Enjoy the afternoon, and I am thrilled to introduce Elisa Keren.
Okay, Don, you got to get out of there.
We have an panelist this afternoon. Rhoda's husband, Don, is on screen. If you see him, that's who you're seeing. And we're working on it technically oh, there he's gone now. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Elisa Keren, and I was chosen to lead this conversation because I'm the exact opposite of all of our panelists. I came from a place where I was surrounded by Jews all the time and moved to a place where I was not. I was born in the Long Island Jewish Hospital in Queens, New York, to 2 Israelis. I grew up mostly in the Northeast and some internationally, and almost always within a short distance of a synagogue. I went to Yale University to study history and then to the London School of Economics to get a master's in international development. And when it was time to choose my first adult home, I chose New York City, one of the strongest, largest Jewish communities in the world. And I thought I was a master of cultural interpretation until I moved to the most foreign place I had ever been to in my travels over 6 continents. And that place is called New York Mills, Minnesota, a town of 1,150 people in the center of the state. I got to New York Mills because, of course, after working on Jewish-Arab coexistence in Israel and then founding an international nonprofit called GECOR, I thought the next obvious step in my career path was to become a singer-songwriter. And so after I started pursuing creative pursuits, I discovered that the best part of being an artist is something called an artist residency. And these are places where artists can go and have the time and space to draw, compose, paint, whatever they want. And they don't have to worry about the pesky issues like paying rent or cooking for themselves. And once I learned about these amazing places, I, of course, as an overachiever, applied to 20 the next week. And the 20th application, the one that almost didn't make it into the mailbox, was to the New York Mills Cultural Center and Arts Retreat. The acceptance letter arrived in my Brooklyn mailbox, and I opened it. I ripped open that envelope in that vestibule, that tiny vestibule between the outer glass door and the inner glass door. And then I danced up the stairs to my apartment, where I then looked up where New York Mills was on the map. And I was completely wrong, because I, at the time, thought Minnesota was where Missouri was. So that was a little bit of an education. And then I discovered that New York Mills was in a place called Ottertail, a county named Ottertail. And to my urban imagination, it sounded so bucolic and lovely. So I promptly went to the New York City Public Library system and took out every guidebook on Minnesota I could find. There was one, so then I added a few on the Midwest. And I learned that if one is going to go to Minnesota, and since I was never planning on going there again, only the one time, I had to do everything right, one has to go canoe camping in the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness area. So I, of course, tried to plan a trip and had very little success, which you can read about in my memoir. But long story short, I ended up calling the executive director of the Cultural Center, who said, "I've got the perfect guide for you." Well, I thought she said guide, but in the end, what she actually meant was, "I have the perfect guy for you." So she said that there was a board member to the organization named Chris Klein, who is an insurance man and an outdoorsman, and he could organize a group canoe camping trip for me. And I called him up and he said, "No problem, I'll set up a group." I arrived in Minnesota in April of 2006, at the end of the month, and I checked in with Christopher Klein, who told me that everyone in the group had dropped out except for him, but he was a gentleman and offered to make it a day trip. But I am nothing if not literal, so I said, "No, it has to be canoe camping." And the 3-day, 2-night canoe camping trip became a 3-day, 2-night blind date. Well, fast forward less than a year, and Chris and I had rented a yellow Penske moving truck, and we unloaded my entire Brooklyn 1-bedroom apartment into it, drove across the north of the country to New York Mills, Minnesota, where I think I became the first Jew to ever live. More, and I now have two sons, a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, who know Judaism through Zoom seders and going to our annual pilgrimage to the Fargo Synagogue for high holidays. And we spend most of our time in the library because they're so loud. So since moving to Minnesota, I've been working on what I call my Ordinarily Unsung project, which is where I craft thematic songs and stories and shows about oddballs in history, including a show called Oy Vey is Jewish for Ufta, which features Jews from the upper Midwest. And many people out east and out west would have no idea that there were many very interesting people who lived out here, including the families of some of our panelists here today. Well, to start off our conversation, we are going to see a video that was created by Prairie Public Broadcasting in Fargo in collaboration with me. We created about 11 videos of my songs about some of the more unique individuals and events in the upper Midwest. And one of them features a man named Herman Fink. Herman Fink owned a grocery store in Wadena, Minnesota during the Depression. Wadena's right a hop, skip, and a jump away from New York Mills. He was a Jewish man, owned the grocery store, bad business during the Depression. So he came up with this great marketing campaign where he would give away free gifts to shoppers for 3 Saturdays in a row. And the gifts he chose and the havoc that ensued are the subject of this next video called When Feathers Flew. Take it away, Dale.
Grocery on the corner and settled down to bring in customers and make it pay. He offered free gifts for 3 Saturdays. At first people crowded in groups and pairs, and the back alley crates climbed high in the air. When it was time they asked all to stand by, and 100 hens rained down from the sky. Feathers flew the chickens too, officials didn't know what to do. Young boys chased hens, escaped fistfights between tightly laced. Mrs. Brown smashed to the ground, 2 car windshields were knocked out. Ladies fussing, gentlemen cussing, and bird waste was everywhere mussing. That week Fink saw the town's ire rise. He decided he needed a different prize. He replaced the hens from the week before with a bird he thought would be a better score. The customers thought they knew what to expect. They came with boxes to collect, but leghorn cockerels can run and fly, and pretty soon everything went awry. Feathers flew the chickens too, officials didn't know what to do. Young boys chased hens, escaped fistfights between tightly laced. Mrs. Brown smashed to the ground, 2 car windshields were knocked out. Ladies fussing, gentlemen cussing, and bird waste was everywhere mussing. Now Wadena settled back down to be a quiet town where boring is better than too many birds around.
Well, now let's move on. Thank you. Now let's move on to the featured presenters today. And these are our panelists. Our panelists today are Rhoda Wolf-Mains, Amy Herbst, Stacy Gendler-Bush, and Jennifer Baden. These are our panelists, and I'm going to start by introducing Rhoda Wolf-Mains. Now, I neglected to say that 3 out of 4 of our panelists had families who owned stores, much like Herman Fink did, and so I thought that video was a great way to introduce them. Rhoda Wolf-Mains was born in Worthington in southwest Minnesota into one of the only Jewish families in a town of 7,500 people. In 1920, after some time in business with his brother in Iowa, Rhoda's father bought a store for sale in Worthington and moved there. By the time Rhoda got to junior high, they were the only Jews in town. Rhoda attended Stanford University and moved to St. Paul when she and her husband Don got married 67 years ago. Rhoda says that the kind of person she became was strongly influenced by her formative years in Worthington. And now I'm going to ask everyone the same first question. So Rhoda, what is your favorite Jewish or Jewish Minnesotan food?
Well, strangely enough, I've had to give that a lot of thought.
Ooh.
Yeah. Because we didn't have a lot of typical things that were available in Worthington at that time. But I finally decided a real Jewish food that I do like is gefilte fish.
Thank you very much, Rhoda. Our next panelist is Amy Herbst. Amy was born and raised in Fargo. Her North Dakota roots began with her great-great-grandfather Isaac, who moved from Ohio to Bismarck to work for a clothing store. After moving to Fargo in 1887, Isaac married and opened the Herbst department store in 1900. Ownership of the store passed to Amy's great-grandmother from her great-grandfather, then to her grandfather, and then to her father and uncles. And Amy herself has fond memories of working in the gift wrapping department. They were part of a tiny but tight Jewish community. There were 3 people in Amy's confirmation class, and Amy's family gathered for Jewish holidays and feasts. And I wish I were there because Amy's mom was a gourmet cook, and she even wrote a cookbook titled From Matzo Balls to Mint Bars. So Amy, you of course must have the broadest selection of options to choose from here. What is your favorite Jewish or Jewsoten food?
Well, I guess it would have to be, let's just go straight to the Jewish carbohydrates and say, right, matzo balls and maybe noodle kugel and perhaps some warm challah coming out of the oven.
I love it. You can't even choose one. I love the 3. Fantastic.
Yep. Yes.
Thank you, Amy.
Oh, you're welcome.
Our third panelist is Stacy Gendler Bush, whose father's family were peddlers who sold goods throughout southern Minnesota. Stacy's grandfather eventually settled down with her grandmother and their 5 children in Blue Earth, Minnesota, where they were the only Jews in town. They owned a junkyard and a small grocery store, and Stacy's grandmother kept kosher, which boggles my mind how she did that. After a stop in Iowa, where Stacy's father owned the local Coast to Coast store, Stacy's family moved to Albert Lea, where Stacy's father bought the Made Right sandwich shop, and Stacy was born. They were among the 10 Jewish families in town, and the teachers consistently mixed up Stacy and the other Jewish girl in class who were not similar at all, except that they were Jewish and had brown hair. So Stacy, I was very curious, what is your favorite Jewish food, and was it served at the Made Right sandwich shop?
No Jewish food was served at the Made Right. My favorite is Hamantaschen, but it's the recipe from my mother's mother, my grandmother, which is a family secret, basically, that it's the only recipe I don't share.
Really? Well, of course, now I want it, and I want to taste those. Absolutely.
It's a honey and nut filling.
Delicious.
And every year when I make them and then give them to my sister and I make it every year with our nieces, and we give them to our brothers who of course don't make anything. And my one brother always says, "Oh, this is how Hamantaschen are supposed to taste."
Just like mom made them. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Stacy. Our final panelist is Jennifer Batten. Jennifer is a Duluth native who grew up attending religious services and Hebrew school in the Twin Forts. Her active involvement in Judaism extended from Jewish youth group in high school to Hillel at college to working as youth director at Beth Jacob Congregation and administrative assistant at Mount Zion Temple. She is currently the activities director at Parnassus Preparatory School in Maple Grove. Welcome, Jennifer. What is your favorite Jewish or Minnesotan Jewish food?
My favorite food is kugel. Both my grandmas had their own unique recipes. And actually my one grandma who was passed away left me her recipe, but it was kind of that classic, a little bit of this, a handful of that, not really specific measurements. And I never made it just because I was kind of scared to test, what this really was. And just in the last year, kind of in the free time I've had with COVID, I finally tried the recipe, and it wasn't exactly as good as hers, but it was close, and it was something fun and kind of unique to finally get my hands on and try.
That is a great benefit of the pandemic. You finally need that recipe. I chalk that up for a win. Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. And let's start this conversation because each of you is from kind of a slightly different experience, all really unusual. And I have to say that there's such a variety of experiences here that people that from my background out in the Northeast would be shocked that there were so many Jewish experiences out here in the Midwest. And I'm so curious, growing up with few or no other Jewish families nearby, how did you identify? What was your
Go tell Barbara.
Judaism? Oh, somebody's talking. Here. Okay, sorry. What was your connection to Judaism? And did the lack of Jews make you feel more or less Jewish? Rhoda, let's begin with you. Where is Rhoda? Lost Rhoda. We're not going to begin with Rhoda. We're going to begin with Stacy.
Albert Lee had about 10 or 12 Jewish families. Not all of us were related, but many were. We had I recall we had Sunday school every Sunday, or at least once a month, actually, not every Sunday, because the Lubavitch rabbis from up here would come down to teach us Sunday school. So we had some background. But we also, when I was very small, there were community seders. Actually, even before I was born, I've seen pictures. There were community seders. The Jews from Albert Lee and Austin used to get together for the high holidays above the Knights of Columbus Hall in Austin. Austin had more Jews. But that dissolved when I was like a preteen, and I suspect it's because the adults couldn't decide how religious the services should be. So we had some Judaism, but we didn't keep kosher or anything. For one thing, my mother's family never did. Her parents wanted to be as American as possible, so they didn't keep kosher.
Did you feel connected, though, to Judaism?
Oh, very much. I always knew I was Jewish, even though the other kids in my classes would say, oh, you're so lucky. You not only get to take Christmas off, but you get to take your holidays off. And then I would say, well, yeah, but I have to sit in services for 3 hours. It's not that much.
Thank you, Stacy. Let me ask Amy how your experience was. Fargo was a slightly more populous Jewish community.
Slightly more, but it depends on, the age group, right? So
Right.
as you in the introduction, I had only 2 other classmates in my Sunday school classes and in my confirmation. And it's very similar to Stacy's. We all got together for a little community Seder. We got together for, all the different holidays. It was always in the basement of the synagogue where all the mothers, everybody would be in the kitchen because there wouldn't be anybody else but the mothers in the kitchen preparing and getting all the food out for all of us. And then, there was no bar mitzvah, we didn't do those at all, but we did do as much tradition as we could. And as Stacy did say, getting out of school on those high holy days was like something very exciting to do. But then I forgot that I had to sit in synagogue all day and everybody's outside playing and I'm, at 3:00 and I'm just getting out at the same time they're getting out. So it's like,
it wasn't really a bonus.
Get those things in between the years. I don't know.
Yes.
So very similar to Stacy's and a very, very rich feeling inside of who I was and how I was brought up, even though it was very small.
It sounds like the isolation almost made it more special.
I think so. And I think that, just the connection with the rabbi was very much, individual, one-on-one, as opposed to the large congregations where you just meet and greet in a way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, Jennifer, you came from Duluth and there was a stronger Jewish population, I'd say, probably than in Fargo. So did you feel kind of a specialness because it was, even though there was a stronger community there?
I would agree kind of with what Amy said, that even with my community, I was the token Jew kind of at school, but because we were still sort of a small knit community at Temple, we kind of had that special bond that, you know, that we were kind of this token group that had our own special relationships and connections and traditions. We had bar and bat mitzvah season in Duluth because it's too cold that, you know, your family from out of town wouldn't come visit if you had a bar mitzvah in the winter time. So, you know, but we did have a season. There was probably 9 or 10 kids per year, you know, when I was that age. And it was kind of all summer long. That was what we did in the summer. So there was definitely, you know, I was kind of alone in my own right at school day to day, but there was definitely a special connection with my school class, my Hebrew school and Sunday school classmates as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now, Rhoda, I don't know if you heard the question I was asking.
I did. I heard it.
And you have the experience that I kind of have now. You grew up with that experience, and I'm so
Well, yes and no.
okay.
First of all, my dad came out to this part of the country from the east to Mankato, and he was involved with a family that was connected to the Temple of Aaron in St. Paul. So by the time we got to Worthington, we came to St. Paul, to Temple of Aaron for the high holidays and stayed
You
with
still have
family.
that connection.
The other thing is that they were my dad's relatives, not my mother's, within 70 miles of Worthington, mostly in Iowa, northern Iowa. And they were all in the same business, and we got together on Sundays. I had cousins in Cherokee, Iowa, who were my age. And so I had my Jewish family, and I had my Worthington friends and family and that community, and they were different, but I did have a Jewish connection. And the other thing is, and I don't know, Stacy, whether it was still around with you, Rabbi Cohn from the Temple of Aaron thought that there were all these, and there were Jewish families all across what's now I-90 from east to west, who had no connections. And he had what I always refer to as a mail order Sunday school.
That's fabulous.
And you did not have to be a member of the Temple of Aaron to be part of it. I don't know how he publicized it because my cousins in Iowa took it too. But you'd get a lesson, and we had a book, and you'd fill out the lesson and mail it back every week. And so we had a little bit of that too. So
What a wonderful way of doing that.
there was a connection, and maybe now with the internet, there could still be in some way.
It's so interesting that everyone had, it sounds like no matter how small or distant the community, there was community. People found a way to make community and found a way to build identity, which is quite spectacular. I mean, it's quite difficult to make that happen, especially in circumstances like you had in Worthington, Rhoda. So it's wonderful to hear about. I'm also curious, in the towns that you live, and it sounds like each of you had like your Jewish world and the rest of the world where you were kind of the only Jew. What were the stereotypes people had about Jewish people in your communities?
Money.
That they had money. Stacey,
Or-
raise your hand.
I don't recall any stereotypes. I didn't have anybody say specifically to me, oh, you're Jewish, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we certainly didn't have any more money, and sometimes less, than a lot of my friends. And so there weren't a lot of stereotypes. I think the money probably is the biggest one, but that's about it. You know, there were no questions about horns and tails kind of things.
That's good to know. I'm so curious where the stereotype came from. I mean, did it come from actual people in the town who had money and were Jewish, or did it come from other perspectives?
It's a good question. I would have to say that maybe it's a mixture of both, but that maybe it is from the outside coming in, because it's, for us, it was such a small community of how could that, you know,
Right.
been fed in other than from.
Organically, right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, did everyone in your, oh, sorry, Rhoda, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in Worthington, there had been before I was born. My mother always said when she first moved there, there was a minion. So there had been Jews that came in and out in different businesses. I think there were wealthier people than the people, the Silverbergs and the Sobels and the Wolves, who had stores
Right.
at the time. And the other thing, and Stacy, perhaps you remember this from Unpacking on the Porch, we did a thing we sent out to people that we identified who had grown up in small towns and what their experience was. And it turned out that boys had more problems than girls.
Really? Tell us more.
Even my kids, my cousins in Cherokee, Iowa, the boy got into fistfights. And my cousin Helen had this wonderful memory of growing up and still sees her girlfriends there. So
I would never have thought how.
and it was maybe because boys when they're really young or maybe it was the times too. This is in the 40s we're talking about.
Mhm. Very interesting. Jennifer, were there stereotypes in your community?
I didn't face a lot. There was some anti-Semitism. I remember my sister getting off the school bus once crying hysterically because a boy physically assaulted her when she wanted to sit on the front seat of the school bus. And he said, "You can't, you're Jewish."
Oh,
There wasn't really stereotypes per se. It was just, you're Jewish, so you can't do this.
Wow.
There was, before my time, there was certain places Jews weren't allowed to go or be members of in Duluth. I really didn't, there wasn't anything specific. It was just kind of, you're Jewish, so you're different.
it is interesting how these ideas and behaviors kind of change generationally, and also when you are living them, especially when they've gone kind of underground, it's so much easier to just push them under the rug yourself and just say, I don't want to think about this. I've got a life to live. I can't bother myself with this one guy who said this horrible thing.
Yep.
Can I ask if any of you were asked to play certain roles because you were Jewish? I kind of the opposite of not being able to sit on the bus, rather like, for instance, when I moved to New York Mills, I was asked to host Passover Seders or give the conversation at school about Hanukkah. And my favorite thing that I do now is I go once a year to the 8th grade when they read Anne Frank and talk about my Holocaust surviving grandparents and aunts and uncles. And so that's been a wonderful role that I've gotten to play being Jewish. Did you guys ever have anything like that?
When I was in elementary school, Cindy Gordon, who was the other Jewish girl in my class, every year around, I believe for Hanukkah, we would have to get up and tell people what Hanukkah was. Because as I say, we were the only Jews in our class. We would have to get up and tell people what Hanukkah was, I swear, every single year. But on the other hand, we also participated, this was in the 50s and 60s, so there was always a Christmas tree in our elementary school. And, we'd make paper chains for the tree. They would have concerts that were all Christmas concerts and stuff. So people, you didn't think about it that much because it was just part of the culture and you fit in. But I did get tired of telling people what my holiday was and no, it wasn't a Jewish Christmas.
Yes, I do too.
And as you mentioned in my intro, people, honestly, all the way through high school, people would confuse Cindy and me, even though our personalities are different. We don't look alike at all, but we both have brown hair and we're both the other Jews in our class.
So clearly that was part of the identity that they saw you as. Otherwise there wouldn't be confusion. Interesting.
Yeah. Wow.
Anybody else have any thoughts that we didn't talk about yet?
I got asked a lot to speak at my friends' church groups, youth groups, or other times, just to explain what Judaism was. A lot of questions about what the Torah is in relation to the Bible. Just kind of giving I was in high school at the time, giving other not Jewish high schoolers kind of an explanation on a surface level of what Judaism is.
Did you guys feel competent? Because I'm often asked to kind of be the expert in Judaism, and I realize how little I know some days. They ask me
Mhm.
questions. I'm like, oh, I never thought about that question to ask. I can't answer that. I'm glad I'm
Years,
not the only one.
years later, after I bet I'd been married up here for, I don't know how long. My mother was asked to give a talk about Hanukkah. And so we helped her write out something and kept saying, Mother, whatever you do, do not say that it has anything to do with Christmas. And it was written up in the Worthington Globe as Mrs. Wolf spoke about Hanukkah, the Jewish Christmas.
Oh my gosh.
So some things don't change, or hadn't anyway, in 20 years.
So all of you are now living in the Twin Cities, is that correct?
Yeah.
And to me, it's a very interesting transition. So you went from these very small Jewish communities to a much larger Jewish community. Did your relationship to Judaism change? And were there any hallmarks of the Jewish experience that were different, that you liked better, or that you missed in your new home? Amy, let's start with you.
Well, I think that the hard part for me is that I came to Minneapolis for school, and then
Mhm.
as that happened, the department store closed, and so families dispersed, and most of the relatives went west to California. And then my mom and dad, Sherry Kornfeld Herbst, decided to come back to St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Paul, because my mom grew up in St. Paul and started a new life here. And so the whole piece of what I had as a Jewish community really changed when I came here, as it dissipated. It became like family, and that was it. And then it became much smaller and very small now. So much different than it was when I grew up.
Which one would never have thought that. I mean, one would
Right?
be surprised or anticipate that. Yeah. Rhoda, how about you?
Well, I always have said that I learned, although at Stanford, most of my friends were Jewish girls, and I still am in touch with a couple of them. But I've always said that I learned what it was, how to live in a Jewish community that was organized, had different parts to it and all of that, from Don's family, who were very involved in the St. Paul Jewish community. And Don's mother was, in particular, at that time, this would be the 50s, early 60s, where Jewish women's organizations were bigger than now, and the Federation. So that was my experience, and I'm still involved.
So it went from mail order to being much
Yeah.
more actively involved.
Yes,
by
yes.
Don's mom. Very interesting. Stacy, how about you?
I came, like Amy, I came up to the U to go to school, joined a Jewish sorority so that, these women are still my closest friends. So they're Jewish. They all grew up here. So I've gotten used to hearing about Talmud Torah, all of that. Plus, I married someone who grew up in North Minneapolis, whose family all lives here. And actually, my family all lives here now, too. There aren't any Jewish families left in Albert Lea. But so because I married into a North Minneapolis family, I've been surrounded far more by Jewishness than I ever was when I was younger. I joined Hadassah and have been active in that. So I have Jewish friends through that. And so now I also was editor in the American Jewish World. So my close friends basically are all Jewish now, which before they weren't, although I'm still in touch with quite a few of my high school friends. And I get along, really well with them. my religion has never come up one way or the other, even though, as I say, I'm much more involved in the Jewish community than I ever was.
Thanks, Stacy. Jennifer, we haven't heard from you. Any difference in experience from the Duluth to the Twin Cities?
Well, I also came to the Twin Cities to attend college, and I made a very conscious decision. I wanted to go somewhere that there was a bigger Jewish population than Duluth. And I also joined the Jewish sorority and was involved in Hillel, and really, tried to find those Jewish friends who are still my friends today. Something that was kind of challenging for me on the other side, coming to the Twin Cities, was the synagogue I grew up at in Duluth was a merge of a Reform and a conservative synagogue. But then I also attended the Orthodox synagogue with my grandparents. And when I was about 10 years old, we had a Reconstructionist rabbi that became the main rabbi. So that's not to put a judgment on anybody or anything, but coming to the Twin Cities and having a straight Reform synagogue or a specific conservative synagogue, I didn't really totally understand what I was transitioning from and to. And that, like I said, that's not a bad thing. That's not a judgment on anyone. But it just was very different for me walking to a conservative synagogue the first time and hearing prayers and tunes I had never heard, or walking in, to any place. They're all good. They all have their, good things. It just was very different and kind of a very big culture shock for me.
You had an unusual experience in your youth being
Yes,
exposed to
very.
so much.
Absolutely.
I find it interesting when I'm talking to people who aren't familiar with Judaism,
Seven.
to explain that there are so many different flavors. I mean, they're like, wait, what?
Absolutely.
And you're like, oh yes, there's a whole world. I'm curious if you guys, and Stacey had mentioned she kept in touch with you keep in touch with a lot of your high school friends. Do many of you keep in touch with the people from your old communities?
I have a little joke amongst our family and friends that when I came to school, it was at the University of Minnesota. And at that point, it was probably, no joking, and probably is still 95% commuter. So I was living on campus my freshman year, and it was kind of horrible in that way because everybody would be gone. And so for me, my spirit goes back to high school and with all my friends, and that's my group and so we get together often. And we last got together and went to Las Vegas, so it was a couple of years ago. And my best friend from Fargo, who we literally went from, nursery school on all the way up, we were taking a taxi to the airport, and she asked to use my phone for a minute. So I passed her my phone. She said, "What's your password?" And before I could say it, she said, "Oh, wait, she typed in, she was right. It was the 4 digits of my home, in Fargo that she put in. And so it's like, that's what is family to me as far as friends. Back to, grade school.
Yeah, I had a group of friends, and there's only one left now, and she's up here, but at the other end of the metropolitan area, so I haven't seen her for a while, but we do talk. And we used to get together at least once every summer because we had scattered to different places and somebody always came home, or there was a class reunion or something like that. So yeah.
Jennifer, you?
And I still say my very, very best friend, who unfortunately died when she was in her 30s, but to this day, I've never had a friend quite like that one. So it all goes back to Worthington.
And as you said, Worthington was very influential in who you are today.
Yeah.
Jennifer, do you keep in touch with the community that you grew up with?
I do. I have a couple really close friends the same age who 2 of them got married to each other. One of them's a teacher and both of us working at a school this year. We've had a lot to compare, and contrast. Whether it's conversation about Judaism or not, I think we just had that bond in our younger years that has kept us in touch today.
One of the things that strikes me is that there is a migration to urban areas, and there always has been for Jewish people. But there's this very rich history of the communities that were created by many of your families who lived in communities where there were very few Jewish people, and the preciousness of that experience. It's lost. There are so few Jews doing that these days, and a lot of that came from it. I'm not an expert in the history here, but it does seem that there were many Jews who bought stores or restaurants, and that's how they became the only Jewish family in a community. And I'd love to hear any fun stories you have about your families and purchasing a store or a restaurant and what happened.
Well, we didn't really see them much.
Oh, were they working really hard all the time?
I just remember, we would not have dinner till like 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock at night, because my dad would come home and my mom would make a gourmet dinner, and then we would sit down and all eat together. And yeah, so it was late meals. But I guess the fondest memory for me is, and this is so not along the vein of Judaism, but it is along the vein of Fargo and what it was like growing up Jewish in Fargo. We had the front of the store windows, display windows, where all the fashion was displayed during whatever seasons. Well, when it was the Hanukkah season, it was not dreidel, dreidel, dreidel. It was Christmas.
Mhm.
And my papa would dress up as Santa Claus
Oh my gosh.
for us on Christmas Eve at their house.
That's a lovely hodgepodge of cultural
Right? But I
influence.
mean, it was just everything. And it was, they were not afraid to ring in anything that was a festive occasion.
Celebration.
Mhm.
Who was telling the story about stockings? Someone here was telling the
I
story.
was.
Oh, Rhoda, tell that
I
story.
told that story. Back to the previous, there was a time on Saturday was the day that the farmers came in to
Mhm.
shop, and the store didn't close until the last customer was out.
Oh.
And sometimes it was very late.
Mm.
Yeah, the story was during the Second World War, when hosiery was very hard to get, especially silk at that time. There wasn't nylon, or maybe it was just starting. And I was a teenager, I was a teenager. And that was the department of the store that I used to work in, with gloves and purses and underwear and hosiery. My dad always had a few special customers, friends who he knew wanted hose for their wives for Christmas. And when they came in, I was told to send them up to the office.
The special few. Any other stories anyone wants to share?
Until I was 3 and my brother turned 13, evidently we had a Christmas tree every year, because this was the 50s and you were assimilated, and to assimilate, you had a Christmas tree. We hung up stockings for Santa. We got, put out carrots and cookies. But then when my brother was 13 and he was going to be bar mitzvahed, he asked my folks not to do that anymore, so we didn't. But we always opened presents on Christmas or Christmas Eve, but that was regardless of when Hanukkah was, but that's mostly because my older siblings were home from college. So it made sense to do that. But I would go to services, with my friends at their churches and stuff, and we never thought twice about it. As I say, when we were growing up in the 50s and early 60s, assimilation was the word. And so you fit in. My folks belonged to those. Now, my mother actually, with some other Jewish ladies, I think in Albert Lee, I don't know if it was also Austin, they had an actual local chapter of National Council of Jewish Women.
Women.
Yeah, but otherwise, my dad belonged to the Elks, he belonged to the Lions, all that kind of stuff, because those were not religious per se. They were, everybody did them.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, I remember when I belonged to Job's Daughters, because my dad was a Mason, there was some Christian stuff there, and I was really uncomfortable with it.
Yes.
Yeah, I was in Joe's.
We're Christian soldiers every time, and I didn't like that.
I
Yeah.
remember going with my dad, knocking at doors, selling, how do they say, brooms, bulbs, and something else for the Shriners.
Mhm.
It
And
strikes me.
imagine the Shriners. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it's like, wow,
Great organizations. I mean, these are all organizations that do amazing things for their
they
community.
do.
And it strikes me that it's in the smaller communities where there aren't a lot of, whether it's Jewish people or people of color, that sometimes that when there are fewer of the different people, those different people are allowed in because there's just one or two of them. And so it's like, oh, you're welcome here. We know you're different, but we'll just we're going to ignore that fact and just welcome you to because we're all in a small community. And it's when the other community gets a little bit larger that there becomes this sense of a threat. And then those people are pushed aside. No, you cannot join this organization anymore.
Right. I was just going to share that I do remember going to catechism
Oh my.
classes with
Oh,
friends. Yeah. So I guess I was dabbling in everything.
Why not?
well,
Your
we
friends
only
are
had
doing-
one. We
Right?
had one Asian family in town who, of course, owned the local Chinese restaurant, but there was just the one. There were, Albert Lee at the time had nobody who was Black, as far as I know. The minority, they were of Hispanic heritage. But otherwise, no, Albert Lee, now I think it's much more mixed, but it was very white. And, we may have been Jewish and different, but we were white. So you fit in just fine.
Yes, there is that. I'm
Yeah.
very curious. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, we had an artist series, and one year, the Wings Over Jordan, I think, they used to be on the radio, came to perform for the artist series, and they couldn't stay at the hotel. And some of the churches arranged for homes to go to. This was back when Worthington was white, and it is no longer. I mean, it's a whole different scene there now. And so.
I'm going to move the conversation a little bit away from the external perspective of who you are and more to the internal perspective. So if your Judaism is like a cake, like your experience of your identity is like a cake, what were the primary ingredients in there? Like, what can you still taste? Was it the going to synagogue till 3 o'clock while your friends were in school and then realizing that you didn't actually have the day off at all? Was it like that your family explain Jewish values to you? What were the things that make up your Jewish identity? Let's start with Jennifer.
The thing that comes to my mind off the top of my head is having Friday night Shabbat dinner. We weren't particularly observant or stopped what we were doing necessarily on Shabbat, but we made it a point to have Friday night dinner together. My mom always cooked something nice. And we lit candles and someone went to the bakery to get the challah and we all kind of stopped what we were doing and had Shabbat. And whatever happened the rest of the week, we still had Shabbat together. And I like that. That still resonates deeply to me today.
What a beautiful tradition.
Mhm.
Stacy.
Well, we didn't have Shabbat dinner, but my mother particularly made sure we knew that we were Jewish. We lit Hanukkah candles. We didn't do challah. She didn't make things that were traditionally Jewish. But they made sure, as I said, we did Sunday school, we had community things. I knew, all the Jews in town, their families, we were really close in that regard. We were close to the families that were in Austin, which was only 15 miles away, some of whom I'm related to. But, they made sure that while it wasn't pushed on you, you knew you were Jewish. You knew you weren't Christian, so that our traditions were followed. We didn't have ham in our house, although we did occasionally have bacon, but we did not, they didn't have ham. My mother didn't keep kosher. But when there were major holidays, not the minor ones, but the major holidays, we participated in them. We would come up to the cities because my mother's family is from here. We'd come up to the cities to go to Temple Israel to have services, and we'd have family seders after the community ones weren't there. So because I had relatives and because our parents, wanted to emphasize that, the boys, and one thing I did want to mention, all the boys in town were bar mitzvahed. None of the girls, and it was a big deal. None of the girls until the 70s, when Julie Gordon, who's now a rabbi, had her own bat mitzvah. Otherwise, it was only the boys who ever did that. And I think that was typical in most places.
Rhoda, what about your Jewish ingredients to your identity?
I guess it was the family. It was the Iowa family. My mother finally found that she did have relatives in Hibbing, and so there was that. And then we went east a lot, even though I guess we missed some of the war years, but before the war and then after, and that was where the rest of the family is, and it was just that connection. I've looked back and wondered, because my brother was that much older than I, and I think he had a rougher time with my mother in particular about being Jewish and not getting involved with girls who weren't and that sort of thing. Because by the time I came around, I didn't get a lot of lectures about it. I just knew that certain things were expected of me. And part of it was retaining the Jewishness and being Jewish.
Amy?
I would say family, and I would say Temple Bethel, and just the quaintness of it. And
I still love Temple Bethel. It's such a sweet place.
it is, it's just so sweet. And, those I think I hold very closely.
Thank you, guys. What's so interesting is it's not necessarily the grand gestures that made you feel Jewish. It was sort of the expectations, the soft expectations, the regular routines, the people you had relationships with, which is so fascinating to me. There were a couple questions. We're gonna open it up more to questions in a few minutes, and anybody who is listening who has questions, if you could put them into the Q&A, because that's where I'm going to be looking for the questions. But there were a couple questions that came through on the chat so far. What level of observance do you feel today in your Jewishness? And I know Amy was talking about her community is rather small. And so Amy, do you go to synagogue often, or what are your—
Sure, Tikva. And, when my older sister and younger sister come into town and it's around the holidays, we'll go. So it's, yeah, I mean, it's slowly coming back, it's cyclical in a way, right?
Oh, yes. Rhoda, how about you? What's your level of observance these days?
Observance? Strict observance, going to a congregation, we belong, but not a whole lot, I would say.
Jennifer?
I actually try to go up to Duluth when I can for bigger holidays. Just kind of those family memories and traditions of going to like the Temple Hanukkah dinner or Passover Seders at the synagogue. Still hold deep, I still have a deep appreciation for those. So if I can make it happen, I try to do that.
Thank you. And Stacy, what's your level of observance these days?
I am not a particularly observant Jew in terms of going to the synagogue. We go on the high holidays. But otherwise, we do light candles and say prayers every Friday night, which we just started doing that, I guess, a decade ago, my husband and I. But as I said, most of my friends are Jewish up here. And so it's just part of being Jewish is now part of my life in general.
Thank you guys for this. I have one final question before I open it up to the chat. And this is a selfish question. So I have 2 little boys who I'm raising to be Jewish in an area where there are no Jewish people. And I'd love to have your best tips on how to help them nurture a Jewish identity, how to help me help them nurture a Jewish identity. Let's start with Amy.
Wowie zowie. I would say whatever you can bring from your childhood, what that was a favorite of yours, to pass it on to them with a very soft understanding that this is a golden nugget and that it should be cherished and be brought to perhaps other traditions within one's life. That's what I would share.
Thank you. That was beautifully personal. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Stacy.
I'm not totally sure, quite frankly. There's summer camp, but I went to summer camp to either Ramah or Herzl. You could send them. The problem is that a lot of the other kids are going to know each other from school or whatever, and your kids aren't going to know anybody, and they'll feel like outsiders, especially at first. So that you should know that right off. But on the other hand, sending them to a Jewish camp really does help instill that Jewishness in them. So, as I say, it's a double-edged sword.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. I went to many Jewish camps, and so I wholeheartedly agree with you, Stacy. Great idea. Jennifer first, and then Rhoda.
I think that's really tough. I agree, trying to create some family traditions of your own that they can keep with them in the future. I would also just say that with COVID and modern technology, there's so many more options on the internet today. And on one hand, I know everyone is missing that lack of personal connection at this point, but at the same time, I think that maybe this opened a door that we didn't have before. And I know, like, I personally have been attending online services more in the last year than I did in probably the 3 years before that in person. So if there's ways to maybe find virtual connections to outside places, I know there's lots of sing-alongs online, or on Facebook pages or classes or just fun arts and crafts projects to follow along with. Maybe trying to, I guess it works both ways, from the Jewish communal agencies providing those still to people further away, but also trying to personally connect with what's out there too.
Thank you, Jennifer. I agree that the pandemic did open this wonderful door of accessing communities that we otherwise wouldn't. Rhoda, let's end this conversation.
Really, I just could say all of the above.
Great answer.
Certainly I was sent to camp, and that was, at that time for me, coming from where I was coming from, was a good thing. I think the family stories and how the family got to the country and appropriate for the ages of your kids, but to keep that whole history going and being an important part of what they are, where they're coming from is
Absolutely,
I
absolutely.
have a question, Elisa. When you go to Temple Beth El with the two boys, do they have school? Do they have Sunday school there?
Pre-pandemic was the last time we went, and the boys
Sure.
were, golly, 3 and maybe 2 and 4. Some, they were younger and
Right.
they weren't old enough for the school yet. And they do have some Hebrew school now, but I wasn't paying attention yet.
The only reason I'm asking is because I do remember going to Conclave during summer, where it was a time that we met up with people in the Twin Cities. So here there were like 3 little Jewish kids coming on a bus to Minneapolis, St. Paul, which was like, oh my God,
Yes.
and met a whole bunch of people. So
That's great.
I'm just wondering whether they still have that.
I'll look into it. Thank you, Amy.
A friend of mine who lived in Ashland, Wisconsin, used to drive her girls every single week to services in Duluth. And I mean, I know that's a lot of driving and everything. I don't know how far you'll be living from Fargo, but if you're really dedicated, that's something to consider. Obviously, though, on the other hand, you can't do it in the winter. But it's something for you to seriously consider.
Yes. Well, thank you all for answering my questions. And now I'm going to dip into the wonderful well of questions that we're getting from our community who's listening. And I'm going to mostly be looking, for those of you who are listening, at the Q&A. So if you're putting questions into the chat, I'm not going to be seeing them. So copy your question into the Q&A, and I believe you can access that at the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says Q&A. Okay, so the first question I see here, which I found really amusing, is how many of you know the third verse of Silent Night? And the reason I find that so funny is because every time I sing, the Christmas carols come on and I start singing, and my husband, who's Catholic, is always like, "How do you know them?" I'm like, "I grew up in America. I mean, come on."
Yeah.
How many of you know the third verse of Silent Night? Raise your hands. I don't actually.
I don't think
I
I
just
know.
know the first one. Isn't it just Silent Night? Oh, Silent Night. I don't know.
I know the first one too.
I used to kind of know the second verse, but
Yeah, the
definitely not
second.
the third.
Yeah, no, right.
Okay, so
Same.
I'm try and cover as many questions as I can. So just for the quick yes and no one, raise your hand if it's a yes. Were you allowed to date non-Jews growing up? Raise your hand.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Bonnie Hoffman asks, our house was one of the only dark houses in the city. Did any of the panelists or participants have lights on their homes? So Christmas lights is, I think, what they're talking
Oh.
about.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
But we did.
Oh.
We did have. It's so hard for me to say these things in this setting. We had a flocked Christmas tree, so I'm right there with you, Stacy.
Safe space, everyone. It's a safe space.
But it was only until I was 3, and then it left. It left.
Pardon?
It left
Until she
when
was-
I was 3.
Until, yeah. I just want to add just a shout out to my wonderful husband who has purchased on his own. He went and purchased those the menorah lights and put them in all of his insurance offices, just because he's like, I'm going to stand up for our Jewish son. So I shout out to Chris. Okay, Beryl Radin, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. I wondered whether any of the participants found Herzl Camp to be a way of meeting other Jewish kids beyond your community, or any camp that you might have gone to.
I went to Camp Tikva, which doesn't exist anymore, but and it definitely was a way to meet kids. But again, as I say, on the other hand, I did feel like the other. A lot of them knew each other. A lot of them could read Hebrew, which I couldn't and still can't do. They knew the prayers and I didn't know them. So yes, it was a good experience, but there were those drawbacks.
Now, Bonnie Hoffman asks, speaking of other, Stacey, you felt other in a Jewish camp because everyone knew each other. Now, Bonnie Hoffman is asking, did anyone feel like the other because you didn't have a lot of Jews around? Did anyone here feel other?
No.
because you all had intentional Jewish community that your families had created. Very interesting. Okay, has Israel ever played, Jerry Ingber asks, has Israel ever played a role in your life? Has it ever been any sort of influence on your children?
Yes.
Well, we had to, I think we had what was called Karen and Me. It was like an envelope that was passed around during Sunday school that we contributed money for that would go over for Israel or whatever the purpose was. But that I've never traveled. My older sister has, and my nieces and nephews have, but I have not.
Mhm.
For those
I
of you,
think
oh, sorry, go ahead, Rhoda.
It means, I think it has meant more to us. The first time I went to Israel, and my parents had been there before you could get to the wall, before they had all of Jerusalem. And seeing what I knew my dad had missed seeing, I was just overcome. And for years after, whenever we went back. But we did go to Israel with our daughter and our granddaughter, 10 years ago? Yeah. And we thought she was too young, but she still talks about it and remembers it. So
Mm.
who knows?
For those of you listening, if you come from an out of the way area, there is some advice to say, if you send your kids to summer camp, Bonnie Hoffman says, request the cabin with the out of towners. So that's great advice.
Mhm.
Okay, I don't know if this is Beatty or B8 Kampf.
Bede.
Bede, thank you. Judaism begins in the home. So what you do, reading holidays, even Yiddish expressions and stories of your experience are the base for all families. Very nice. Jerry Ingber, what to consider for your two young sons in terms of tips for instilling Jewishness in their lives? Consider a move to a Jewish community. Now, I have to say that is a very good point. It is certainly an option for many. I am choosing not to at this time. And so I am going to learn from all of our panelists here that the way to solve the problem is by building intentional community. And I think that you all are such wonderful examples of that. So here's a question from Ellen Premack. At what age did you know or understand the Holocaust?
I think I'm still learning.
I think that's the real answer for everybody, honestly.
Yeah.
Amy.
Yeah.
Such a huge thing. But
Yeah, I
did
don't,
you guys learn about
I
it?
don't know,
or
it was just
you-
always there.
Mhm.
I was about,
I kind of do remember in 8th grade in American history having a horrible movie. I wish I could remember the name of it. Something Gray Fog, or what was it called? Something, but that was like, I think the eye-opening experience.
So Ruth Usam asked, and I think some of you talked a little bit about this, are there still Jewish families in your city town? So Duluth, Jennifer, Duluth still has a Jewish community, is that correct?
There is. It's definitely smaller than when I was a kid, but yes, there is still a synagogue there.
Okay. Rhoda, Worthington, any Jews left?
no.
No. Amy, I can answer for, I'm gonna let Amy answer. Fargo, Jewish community.
No idea.
The synagogue is generally, it's a very small synagogue and it's somewhat, it fills up on the high holy days though.
Yeah, I have a cousin up there who's been involved with the synagogue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stacy,
No, the gentleman who is the last Jew to live in Albert Lee, he, as he got elderly, he moved up here to be near his daughter. So there aren't any Jewish families at all left in Albert Lee.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that about Austin at all.
I wonder if there were Jews in Laverne and Worthington and Jackson and Fairmont and Wells, all the way across. I wonder if there's any. No.
I don't think so, because what happens, of course, is typical of small towns. The kids grow up and move to a more urban area, and eventually the parents either, die or they move to be closer to their kids or somewhere warm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question from Laura Cohen to Rhoda. Did you know the Brandt family in Worthington?
The which? No,
The Brandt family.
Grant. No. I didn't.
Okay.
Haven't
From-
really been there since 1950.
Mm. From B Camp to Jennifer, do you remember the European Bakery?
I sure do. My dad worked downtown not far, and he brought us challah from European Bakery almost every week.
Ooh. Was that your favorite thing from the European Bakery?
And cookies, all sorts of stuff. But yes, absolutely.
Sounds amazing.
And the owner was a member of the synagogue, so he made my bat mitzvah cake and all sorts of stuff.
Whew. Okay, question from Ruth Usam. Did your schools hold class on Jewish holidays? I'm going to guess yes.
Mhm.
Is that the case? Whatever, yes.
My
yeah.
school also always had a knack for
Have class
scheduling
on
picture
Jewish
day or
holidays.
something important that you couldn't
Oh,
miss,
yes.
but you also couldn't miss.
Always. Picture
Yeah.
day on Rosh Hashanah. It
Yes.
never failed. Or Yom Kippur. It never
Yep.
failed. It's like they plan it that way. It's like, seriously, I'm going to have to be with all the other kids on the other day that, Mhm.
I understand the U of M this year is starting school on the second day of Rosh Hashanah,
Mhm.
even though they've been told for years, here's the date, they did it anyway. And that used to be relatively common at the U, that they wouldn't look at a calendar,
Yeah.
other than the Christian one.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm scanning the chat. So ladies and gentlemen who've written some tips to me on the chat, I want to thank you. I have not had time to look at them while we're talking, and I look forward to perusing them after the panel so I can take all of your advice into account. Let's see, I'm looking at see if we've missed any questions in the chat. Different experience. Okay, I'm hearing a lot of experiences from people. No more questions specific in the chat. Does anyone, if you have a specific question that we haven't answered, I invite you to write it into the Q&A and we will answer. And to give the listeners a few minutes to write their final questions in, I wanted to ask, is there anything that we haven't covered in this conversation that you were hoping to share or talk about? Panelists. Any questions for our listeners that we can encourage them to answer in the chat? No worries. So what I am going to do now is I'm going to thank everyone. I don't see that we have any other questions coming. Oh, wait, no, we do. Okay, where's the question? Oh, someone wants to know how many of us are on Zoom. I do not have that answer to that question. So I hope all of you out there are getting something out of our conversation. I certainly am. But I'm going to close up our conversation, and I want to thank all of you, especially our panelists, for being here, taking time to talk with us and share your experiences. I want to thank all of you who have been listening. I want to thank Robin Doroshow for inviting me to be here and to making this event possible and allowing me to participate in it. Oh, I have an answer for how many people. There are 59 people here. And I see that there is one other question here. When is the next panel session? Thank you for reminding me, Bonnie. That is the next thing I have to tell you. The answer is we don't know, but there will be one. We're going to have 2 more of these conversations with other panelists. As much as I'd love to see all of you, Stacy, Amy, Rhoda, Jennifer, again, next time, I hope you'll join us on the chat end, and we'll have some other individuals sharing their stories. And please stay tuned. I think you can check the JHSUM website. And for those of you who don't know, that's the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest. And sign up for their mailing list, sign up for their events. It's a wonderful organization that catalogs